and welcome to another episode of Coffee and Conversation podcast with alumni. My name is Diana Guzman Lugo. I'm the Career Services Coordinator, and I would like to allow our guest to please introduce himself.
Hi, good morning. Good morning to everybody who's tuning in. My name is Christopher McKee. I'm a 1997 MTS JD graduate from Emory, from Candler and the law school.
So, Christopher, before we get into your time at Candler, you're still a practicing lawyer and you're a professor now, correct?
Yes. So I am more on probably more of a practicing lawyer, but I do teach and have been teaching at Colorado Law School since 2009. I've had a variety of roles. I've been the director of experiential learning. Most of my teaching has been in the area of placements in law school for people doing externships and doing kind of clinic practical work. But I am teaching 1L criminal law to first year law students, and next year I'll be doing a forensic science clinic. So I do wear the hat of teaching as an adjunct professor at the law school. But by and large, I am still a practicing lawyer. Have specialized since a few years out of law school in forensic science issues. And so I generally do that kind of niche part of cases. And so I am connected on federal and state cases around the country that have something to do with forensic science. So DNA, firearms, issues like that.
That sounds very interesting and probably not what we imagine from watching TV shows. Um,
It is not as much of what you see on TV unless you're watching court TV and you're still only seeing sort of like how it's being presented, but not necessarily how, kind of the sausage is made all before the case and, the investigation and consulting with experts that go into cases. But it is as interesting, I think, as it is on TV.
that's good to know. I do have a question. So you came in from undergrad knowing that you wanted to do law, but what also drew you to do the dual degree?
So for undergraduate, I was a religious studies and history double major and a minor in political science from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. And I was not ready to sort of let go of the religious studies part of my education. And I was able to find a law school that had a partnership with an excellent seminary like Candler. And so I was, sort of lucky to be able to sort of combine the two. And I see them very much as connected and interconnected. And I had applied to some other law schools that also have a seminary connected, and so would have been able to kind of continue that path. But it was really my own desire to continue to be wrestling with the topics that I think religious studies and I think seminaries give you the opportunity to do. And I do very much see that connected with how I was viewing law school and what I wanted to do with my law degree, being an advocate for, underprivileged, um, oftentimes, despised parts of society. And so I kind of knew that track was to be an advocate for those who needed advocacy the most.
Now, what you learn two very different skills, I think, from law school and seminary, at least when we talk about the breakdown with what our classes may look like and what our homework assignments may look like. But what were some skills that you think you got from Candler that you couldn't have gotten anywhere, well, from seminary that you wouldn't have been able to get from anywhere else that were so crucial to your development?
So I would actually say that I think that there are many things that I learned at Candler that complemented the law degree in a way that has made me the lawyer that I am, and that I think also would make any law student a better lawyer. And so there are a couple that I thought of at the time, and in hindsight and retrospect, I think also um, are important skills. So textual analysis is done by both. I think diving in to New Testament class with Luke Johnson made me a better lawyer of reading statutes and reading laws and thinking deeply about it. I think of my preaching classes that I took, with Gail O'Day, of helping me be a better courtroom advocate, of being someone who could include all of, I think, the emotional force that you should in an opening and a closing argument to a jury. And I think definitely the pastoral side of the focus of attending to people's needs and meeting people where they are that I learned at Candler complemented anything I did in law school that put me into contact with clients. And so I actually saw there was a lot of overlap in a number of different ways. And it made me a better lawyer, 100%. And then the last thing I'll say is for me, the Candler community was my community. I felt less of a connection with the law school. There were a number of people doing very different things in law school, are there for very different reasons. And I would say sort of the minority were there to do public interest work with their law degree. And so I found kind of my people and my community at Candler, and that helped support me in the path that I was going to go on, which was to, sort of help underprivileged people.
That's very interesting. I almost wish we could have Dr. Kemp here right now. He's a current professor at Candler, and he used to be a lawyer too. And I know that he's done some work with law in the Old Testament. So it
Yeah.
would be fun to see because you probably agrees a lot with a lot of the overlap.
Yeah, there's a tremendous amount of overlap. I'm teaching 1L criminal law this year, and there are a number of my classes where we talk about, Old Testament law, where we talk about Exodus, where we talk about, perhaps defenses that are recognized in part of the Western legal tradition, dating back thousands of years. And so, yes, absolutely. I'll look forward to talking to Dr. Kemp sometime about this.
Well, outside of Old Testament, I see that you also um, put New Testament and homiletics and feminist theology as some of your favorite classes. Here, would you talk a little bit more about them?
Sure. So yes, I'm often asked on the alumni board of like what class, meant the most to you, and it's hard to pick. But I would say that, Luke Johnson's New Testament, Intro to New Testament, was really profound for me to dive into the text. I was raised Catholic. My father's also a Congregationalist, and we would go to both Congregationalist and Mass on a lot of occasions. But as far as like diving into the text, that's not what my religious studies undergraduate degree was, but very much became a focus of what my time at Candler was. And I think it was the passion and the emotional connection to the text that Luke Johnson brought to that course that lit the fire within me that was already there, but sort of amplified it. Certainly preaching is something that is close to my heart. It is not necessarily part of the Catholic tradition in terms of its upfront focus. But for me to deliver the message of the word, is something that I think is very critical to the life of those who are in ministry. And it's certainly a critical skill for lawyers. And so I feel like I'm able to sort of channel some of what I learned in homiletics to the way that I present my cases and think about my cases. And then finally, Rebecca Chopp's feminist theologies for me was, a wonderful opportunity to change the lens and perspective to the text and the approach to the text that, I feel like I have ever since that class walked into reflecting upon scripture and reflecting upon the word from a different perspective than perhaps the perspective that I originally would be walking into it. And so, all of those together, I think were heavily influential on how I was and am living, post my graduation in the late 90s there.
I think a concern I heard earlier from one of our students was how, as a lawyer, do you stay hopeful in the world and God and not get cynical after so many heavy cases that weigh down on you?
It's interesting. So a couple of my 1L students this year, so the 1L's first year law students, um, have asked me kind of this very question. Like, how do you stay hopeful 30 plus years after being a public defender, which is what I have been most of my life? And even if I am a practicing lawyer, I generally work with those who have indigent clients. And I would say that I have been able to stay true to myself um, in doing what I want and representing the people that I want, and so I haven't felt the pull um, to maybe chase other things, money, or sort of like fame or anything like that. Um, the other is that when I am involved with working one-on-one with a client or working one-on-one with another lawyer, that deeply personal and relationship that I'm in gives me lots of hope that there are people fighting for other people, or there are people that are better than the worst thing they may have ever done, or maybe didn't do it at all, and they're innocent, and you are fighting for them. It gives me hope to stand next to someone and be an advocate for them. It gives me hope when juries respond and do the right thing that I, hope for and restore my hope. When I, have been able to get the kind of plea that I think is fair and just from a prosecutor, that gives me hope. So I don't know. I think it is in the small things that you can still find and get hope. And I kind of can help cancel out the noise of everything else that I think would breed a lot of cynicism if you, I think, didn't work so closely one on one for the small victories.
It's honestly very beautiful and very inspirational. I remember, for those of you listening in, I've actually met with Christopher earlier this semester, and I remember you saying that you wished that your degree would have been MDiv and JD instead of MTS. But a lot of the MDiv pastoral care things that we learn through, especially Con Ed, kind of just do it. They just, without really whether you're ready for it or not, whether you've been a pastor for years or not. And I feel like in the place you are situated, you're it's essentially it is pastoral care to be able to be a calming presence for your client and to be able to be someone people can lean on.
Absolutely. And so when I have said that I kind of wish I had been MDiv, a little bit of selfishly, I would have loved to have been a part of the Candler community for one more year. Um, but it also, I think, would have exposed me to some of the skills that I think you do get thrown into the deep end in Con Ed and in pastoral care that was not as much of a focus because I was in MTS and it was a little more academic and scholarly, at least it was then at the time. Um, and so I will also say that I think that, um, being a public defender, I was a public defender in DeKalb County, was my first job out of law school. I went from being a kind of clinic student in my last year in both schools to at the public defender's office in DeKalb County. I took a job and started the week after graduation, and then sat for the bar later in the summer. And that job was still throwing me in and learning on the fly and directly working with people. And that was a lot, like at times 300 clients at a time. And so you were absolutely expected to kind of roll with it and be in there. So sorry, a long-winded answer to say that, I think I would have benefited from 1 year. It's kind of selfish. But I do also think that I got all the skills that I needed to do my job, um, by doing that 4 year program.
But one thing I really love and appreciate is in the beginning of this, you mentioned how some of the skills at Candler overlapped with your skills you were learning in law school. Because I think one of the things that students struggle with when they leave seminary, especially if they decide that they no longer want to be in a ministerial job, is how do you translate the skills that we've learned in seminary to any other work field? And I think a lot of people, not just seminary students, look at theology and they're like, what are you going to do with a theology degree?
Mhm. I mean, I am biased. I think it's the best education in the world, uh, because I think it makes you look within, and understand something about yourself as much as it is about understanding something about the world that you live in. I think that anyone who is walking out of seminary will have the kinds of skills that I've talked about that I think helped me as a lawyer. Understanding the nuances of text, understanding the importance of being in relationship with other people and other human beings, the importance of seeing from different perspectives and different voices. All of those things will help you in whatever you do. And so if somebody doesn't want to, no longer wants to be in the ministry, we need you as social workers in public defender offices. We need you as investigators. We need you in a variety of different ways, and that's just sort of in the sandbox of which I live. You will be able to have this kind of skills that will prepare you for any job, and hopefully one that sustains you in the way that gives you hope, like we talked about before, but also gives you happiness and gratitude. I have to say that I think like the most important thing in life is to be grateful and to celebrate that gratitude every day for what it is you have. Some of my clients are at the worst place that you can ever imagine. They live in prison. They are accused of something terrible. They may have done something that, from objectively, we may all say is terrible. But I think that you can still bring a sense of gratitude to what it is you have each day, even in the face of some really terrible things. And that gratitude will change you and change the people around you, and to stay focused on that. So I guess along the message of there is, I think what you learn in seminary or what you learn in theological education, I think is to nurture that sense of gratitude.
So developing a lens of gratitude, what other habits do you think seminary students should try to develop during this time?
So I think while in seminary, it is essential, I think, to be a part of the community. And I know that that is a challenge in all of education, especially if you're a hybrid or you're not together uh, in a learning environment in a residential um, uh, setting. Um, but that said, I think you can foster community even in your own separate places by staying connected with the people that you connect with. I have to say, like, I am a lover of Zoom. I think Zoom is something that does create a sense of intimacy and connection that is far better than I ever would have thought was possible when I was in the 1990s, before any of this came on line. I think that so I think for the seminarian, I think you need to build community first. Second, I think you need to build a sense of practice for yourself to make space for what nurtures and sustains you. And whether that is, a faith community that you're a part of, or whether that is, a deep reflection in the text. Those things are, I think, essential to a theological education and community. And so lean heavily on those. They will sustain you and do the kinds of things that I've been talking about, in sort of helping that practice of gratitude.
Something quite similar to your role and the role of a pastor, I feel, is um, you have many clients. Depending on you, likewise, a pastor may have many congregants coming to them for answers and support. So, how do you find time to balance the need and meeting those needs of others while also making sure to have time for yourself and your own needs?
Yeah, the one luxury you don't have is time. And a couple students have asked me this semester, you teach, you're still a practicing lawyer, you seem happy, and how do you do it all? And then I sort of tell them that there's a third thing that I do, which centers me and I love the most, which is, I'm a garden leader, a co-garden leader in a community garden. And the community at the community garden, which is not far from where I live, um, is something that sustains me, and I guess sort of like selfishly is where I can go and find some sort of peacefulness from all of the need, the tremendous need, the student need, the client need. I can go and, work my garden plot. I can go and talk with other gardeners about what we're planting this season, or, how difficult it is to grow vegetables in an arid landscape like Colorado. And that's where I carve out some time for myself, and to be a little more connected to the earth, a little bit more connected to a different community that is, focused on growing things. And so that third hat that I wear of being in the garden and a community garden leader and volunteering to be a part of that community is something that I think is also essential to kind of put into your life some room for you. And so that's kind of how I do it.
I think there's some theology around that with the harvest.
100%. Yes.
I actually think there's a classic Candler right now for environment and theology. I forgot the name of it, but where they
Mm. That is very, when I did my undergraduate religious studies, there was a focus that I had in particular on the wilderness and on the environment. And there was a professor that I had where that was his specialty an area, and it is something I've always stayed somewhat very connected to. Is, wilderness or the land or the environment, and very much from a theological approach.
for the MTS, you had to do a thesis, didn't you?
Back then, we were right in the transition between thesis and no thesis. So I did work on a thesis. Mine was on a Harvard-trained lawyer, William Stringfellow, who was sort of a radical justice uh, warrior, really, representing people of unpopular causes. And so my focus was on his work within the Episcopal Church and LGBTQ issues that he was a pioneer fighting for. And so, yeah, that's what I worked on for my thesis.
That's beautiful. I love to ask just because I love to see, I feel like what people choose for their thesis is a little insight to like what's near and dear to their heart or what caught their attention.
I think it reveals who I am in that sort of radical lawyer, justice focused, praxis oriented mindset of the law to me is as much about practicing my faith in my theology every day, just as it was for Stringfellow, just as it was for you know, a number of people who go into the law to make a difference. And so, yeah,
Well, I think we need more lawyers like you. I know, I remember my Con Ed one was at was it the state prison here in Georgia? And if I knew that each of those ladies had a lawyer like you, I would rest assured that at least that they were in the hands of someone that truly cared for them.
yeah, I appreciate that. Yes, and and I'm glad to hear that Con Ed is in the prisons and chaplaincy, pastoral care to those perhaps in the most need are populations like that. So it's wonderful to hear that there's that connection with Candler and the kind of work that I do.
Now it seems like there was a plan coming in for you from undergrad, with law school, with seminary, going straight into law. What was something unplanned for that happened either during your time at seminary or outside that how do you account for when your path starts to get a little bit shaky?
I would like to say that I had the plan as much as the plan sort of worked out for me, but I was kind of stumbling through what exactly it is I was called to do and to be. And so I actually didn't know whether I would do kind of something civil. In one of my first externships was with senior citizens through Atlanta Legal Aid to do the senior citizen representation, which was wonderful advocacy work, very difficult work to do. And I am not someone who, feels necessarily comfortable in the criminal world, in the sense that, I kind of abhor violence. I don't, enjoy it in any way. Um, the the sense of loss and trauma that is in the criminal world. And I wouldn't have expected that that's where I would be, but I did a first year, my first summer out of the law school portion of that 4-year program. I worked with the Georgia Justice Project and Doug Amar, and which is a nonprofit criminal defense practice that has a more holistic wraparound service aspect to it. I was able to connect up Candler students with that office as part of me going there. Um, and they had a business, a lawn care business to teach job skills and foster job skills for those who had been accused so that you would have some hope of a job after being in the criminal justice system. And all of that was unexpected. That all of that matched up perfectly with my kind of worldview, theological view, and view of what one could do with a legal degree. So from that point on, it kind of launched me. I did take that time at the senior citizen Atlanta Legal Aid position to kind of make sure that that's really what I wanted to do to be in the criminal law arena, and it confirmed that for me. And from there on, I just had wonderful opportunities, but everyone was, I think, by chance or fate. And so, there was a plan for me. Maybe I didn't necessarily always drive that plan, but I was very thankful and have always been thankful for what I have had, in front of me. So that's kind of my, I guess, reaction to your question about path. I think it's all been kind of somewhat unexpected.
No, that's truly very inspirational the way things just lined up, especially with your interests and the way you've been able to be there for people in such a delicate state, and in such a vulnerable position in their lives.
Yeah, it's funny, so my first year law students, there's a large number of them who do not like criminal law, who, find it very difficult emotionally. And maybe it's because of personal experience, or maybe it's just because the world is what it is. And I have to say that I hope that I bring for them um, a grounding as to why it's important to learn about it and to think about it. And even today, where I'm teaching on the defense of necessity, and it's about criminally punishing mostly homeless people for having to sleep outside. And the defense of necessity is something that you may be able to plead. You may be able to get somebody not to prosecute them. You may get a jury to acquit them because needing to sleep is a biological and human need. And to criminally punish someone for doing something like sleeping outside doesn't seem to me to serve society's interests, but yet we know we punish people and we um, label them as unpopular or people we don't want. And so I feel like, I get a chance to sort of preach to 68 students about something that's really important to their lives, even if they kind of walked into this criminal law class not thinking that it had anything to do with them. It does. It has to do with everybody who you live with in your town and in your city, in your state and in your country. And I hope that kind of message gets communicated.
Yeah, I think the saying ignorance is bliss is not necessarily true, but it does ring why it is so heavy. I know, at least for me personally, when I was at Arendelle, being confronted with all the things that incarcerated women have to go through, it was heavy, and it was heavy to wrestle with this reality, and then sometimes realize that there wasn't much we could do for it. You're in a great position where you can do something, but you're still at the will of the jury and the judge. Um, and so I think some of that might be why it's so hard for people, some of that frustration of wanting to be able to do more, wanting to be able to change the systems, not understanding why other people hearts don't break for this as well. But I think I mean that I've seen that ring true for seminary students. I feel at Candler specifically, a lot of Candler community is really social justice oriented. Something I heard from the Dean of Admissions last year was Candler accounts for less than 3% of the overall Emory population. Um, and we account for 1/3 of the service hours.
Yeah, not surprising. Of the people and what you go and pay forward and do out in the community. Um, yeah, I'm not surprised by that because I think those are folks who are driven to do it. And I come from a tradition that sees the New Testament, and maybe this comes a little bit from Luke Johnson too, is it is a social justice text. It's inescapable that is the message of Christ. It is the message for the church to be, I think, social justice oriented. And if you are grounded in that, in the text, and if you're grounded in the faith communities, um, you'll do it and you'll do that work. And the other thing I will say is that I don't regret like being the least powerful person in the courtroom. The judge has power. The prosecutor has unbridled power. They have the power of discretion to bring a case or not bring a case or offer a plea or not, and probably is even more powerful than the judge at times. The jury is sometimes incredibly powerful because they're sitting in judgment. I don't have to judge. All I can do is to try to argue the law, also to bring a sense of compassion to the job. But I know that I am not in a position of power. And I'm okay with that. And I actually feel like that fits me as a person. And I think that it is um, how I also think about my faith. Um, I don't have to be the most powerful person, but I hopefully am a person who's decent and puts integrity above power. And so Just in response to what you said there about it, I am glad I get to be an advocate and can bring some skills. But I know a lot of the people on the outside are the ones who are going to be the ultimate decision maker, and that's okay.
Sorry, I'm taking that in for a moment because that's such a powerful statement, and that's such a beautiful view of, again, your role in faith, your dependence on God. Because you're right, I would not want to play judge in this world.
Yeah,
Um,
I've never wanted to do it, and I'm happy to not have to do that. Yeah.
Very fair. You have mentioned a little bit throughout this about your faith, your Catholic background. One of my favorite things about Candler is that even though it's a United Methodist affiliated seminary, you see all different types of faith represented. I'm Pentecostal, and I work at I'm part of Familia at Candler, which is the Latin group at Candler, and I'm the vice president or president is Catholic. We had a vigil once, and she brought holy water, and I brought anointing oil, and we said when the Catholics and the Pentecostals meet. And I think that's just a beautiful thing. Was your experience like that similarly?
Absolutely. The dean has said a number of times. I've been involved in the alumni board just for the last year. The dean has said a number of times about how ecumenical the Methodist Church is in this space and what makes Candler special, and I think is part of because it is United Methodist, which has always, I think, uh, had a place in room for others of faith, and perhaps even those who are struggling or don't have faith. Um, and it was that for me. I loved going to chapel at Canon Chapel. I felt as connected to those services as I have, to any service that I've been to in my life. And as I said, I was raised Catholic and Congregationalist. So, I lived in two different worlds. One, sort of high liturgy and low liturgy in that sense. Um, but yes, 100%. I think that makes Candler special. I think it makes the Methodist Church special. And I've always felt a deep connection to both because of all of the people I encountered and how we were living out our faith and maybe different traditions.
Well, you have said some wonderful and amazing things throughout this session. I just wanted to ask, do you have any last minute comments to any current or prospective students that might be listening in?
Well, one, thank you for this conversation. Thank you for the generosity of the words that you just said, and really giving me this opportunity to talk. I don't often get questions about my faith or questions about my background. Because I live so much of my life in the law, and there's not as much interest, I think, in folks asking me about that or listening to me about it, except for my students who have to hear about it. And it creeps in. Um, I would say that if you are in Candler or you're thinking about going to Candler, I would wholeheartedly, listen out for the call about why it is you're there and what you can do. And you can do anything. I think it is like such a valuable education that will sustain you in this world and in your lives. That if what brought you was a whisper of a call, follow it. I think you will find that it is something that will enrich any life that you have. And so Candler's a special place. It's a special place in my heart. It always has been. And I really do love this community, and anybody who's a part of it or even listening into this, you have stumbled into something that I hope you will find sustains you. So that's that's what I have to say.
Thank you so much, Christopher. And you can find our podcast on YouTube, Apple Music, and Spotify. So hopefully you can tune in and listen in.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Thanks, Diana. Nice to see you again.